is 22nd, 5796, Thursday, April 9th. $57.86. No one really knows for sure. Elevate, Elu, Divrei, Elokim, Chaim, but this is what we live by.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge.
3761, creation of the world, birth Adam and Eve, Chava. 3631, 130, Seth, son of Adam, was born. 3526, 2 Enoch, son of Seth, born.
Is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just
104 days of the shit, baby.
That we haven't, or that Kabbalah
Let's do it.
At all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerously exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregatia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or find these episodes after autumn of 2021, and you want to wear a series, you can find that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism and hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Folks, well, welcome back. We're going to get to, in some ways, the high watermark of the Kabbalah tonight. Because its glorious formulation has basically become Jewish theology. And that's something I think that, you can't really shake a stick at that. It's a really incredible thing that fundamentally one guy, in many ways, formulated how Jews all over the world understand their God, understand their scriptures, understand the world that they live in. And it's a glorious version of the Kabbalah. It's so deeply embedded in Judaism that phrases like Tikkun Olam, a phrase that I bet everybody in this class has heard a dozen times. Shuls have Tikkun Olam committees. This idea comes through many ideas that are commonplaces in Judaism really emerge from Gloria. And so I will get to his ideas. Now, Austin will deal with his ideas for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that most of his books aren't translated into English. The vast majority are not translated into English. And even the books that remain in Hebrew are so technical and so difficult that I had to admit, Austin can read pages of these books and still not know quite what the world's going on. These books are very part of how Luria's Kabbalah developed was people trying to make sense of what in the world he was talking about. And so part of what happens is that the books are very complicated, and that the complicatedness is it has its own life. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as we get to Santuarium. But to rewind a little bit, talk about this period that I sometimes refer to as the interregnum. That's the period after the composition of the Zohar, but before the rise of Luria and Kabbalah. What we have is that in that period, Kabbalah did not spread very quickly. It was a very underground, it was a very elite, it was a very hush-hush kind of thing. That's not to say people aren't publishing things, talking about published ideas, but there was no desire to make it public. It was a very hush-hush, elite, esoteric, very much so. And by 1492 would be Alhambra decree, which declared that basically all Muslims and Jews had to leave Spain or convert. You have the Kabbalah transforming from being very elite, very inner, very inward-looking, very secretive, to the Kabbalah actually becoming imbued with a very eschatological, it has to do with the end of the world, and very messianic meanings. And so in the aftermath of the disaster that was 1492, Kabbalah is going to branch out into the world, and it's going to become popularized. And many of the refugees who fled from Spain were actually saved by a Muslim leader, which I don't know why that doesn't get more press, but it should. Bayezid II was the Muslim leader of the Ottoman Empire that basically sent his entire fleet to Spain and saved as many Jews as he could. Not because he was a great guy or anything, he may have been that too, but he realized that you could all your doctors, lawyers, and scientists out of a country. Of course, he wanted them, and he was right to do it. The Ottoman Empire was something huge boom implication of the refugees after the 1492 Alhambra decree, by the way. Also notice that Spain did terribly good in many ways in the aftermath of that either. So many of these Jews are going to settle in the Ottoman Empire. One of the main places they're going to settle is going to be in Salonika. Salonika and Warsaw have been traditionally known as the only two Jewish cities in the world. And so Salonika and Greece is going to be one of the places they're going to settle. But many of the Kabbalistically inclined people are actually going to move to the place they're most familiar with, at least in their sort of imaginary landscape. And that's up in the Galilee at a place called Sfat near Meron. Shimon Bar Yochai is the traditional author of the Zohar, was thought to be there. Meron and Sfat, where new forms of Kabbalah began to emerge. Kabbalah began to be popularized. This is a very important moment in the history of Kabbalah. We teach publicly at some level. There are classes you can take on Kabbalah. And what ends up happening is in this area, there is a rise of a new form of Kabbalah that is highly systematized, highly intellectualized, very encyclopedic, and very synthetic, which is just to say that it's organizing all kinds of Kabbalistic ideas into something like a Kabbalistic system. That system, of course, the major one is going to be Joseph Cordovero. We'll talk about him in just a moment. Of course, other forms of Kabbalah also existed at this time. We talked at length last time about Abraham Abba-Mafia and his so-called ecstatic or prophetic Kabbalah. This is a completely other form of Kabbalah that doesn't really care much about the Sefirot and that kind of stuff. He knows about them and he's aware of them and he's interested in them, but that's not part of the part and parcel of his project. His project is a kind of intellectual communion with the divine, and that's accomplished by a wide range of things like breathing techniques and focusing in on Hebrew combinations of Hebrew words and various kinds of mantra-like structures. So there are other forms of Kabbalah that came about in the milieu of the Zohar that didn't quite make it. Now, what's going to be really important is that in these that milieu and the Sefedian form of Kabbalah Isaac Luria and his student Chaim Vital reincorporate some of Abulafia's ideas, and that's going to basically save Abulafia from oblivion. Remember, he got basically excommunicated and exiled from a tiny island in history. He dies. He's going to be kind of resurrected in many ways by Luria and Kabbalah. And as I mentioned, this is the area in Safed where Kabbalah is being systematized and it's being popularized. I cannot stress that enough. Kabbalah is being taught in public. Why? Because they think the world's about to end. They think that the 1492 Alhambra Decree was the beginning of the end, and that Kabbalah, the unveiling of Kabbalah to the world, would ultimately lead to a kind of eschatological and end-of-the-world event, and that end-of-the-world event would be led at some level by Kabbalistic speculation. It would urge in the Messiah. And in fact, there were many people at that time, Cordovera being one, Chaim Vital being another one, Luria being another, that many people, including those people themselves, thought they were the Messiah. Chaim Vital, have some of his notes, his autobiographical sketches, diaries. He even says in his notes that if I just studied the Mishnah a little longer, I would have become the Messiah. I know it. So these guys are really convinced that the Messiah is not just around the corner, but they might be it. And that kind of idea that you might be the Messiah and you might be ushering in the Messianic age is going to be hugely important as we get to next time when we get to Shabbatai Tzvi and his mystical heresy that leads to many people to believing that he's the Messiah. So Shabbatai Tzvi is next week. And next time. So as I said, this is a time period where Kabbalah is being popularized. This is a time period where Kabbalah is being global. The masses being opened up to really elite dudes. It's not opened up to everybody. There are new services invented. Kabbalah Shabbat, almost certainly the most popular Jewish service that exists today. If you've been to a Jewish service, you've probably been to a Friday night Kabbalah Shabbat service. That service being developed at this time, and Shlomo Alkabetz writes the centerpiece of that text, that prayer service, Lecha Dodi, come my beloved, come my bride, and that text, Lecha Dodi, is a classic now. And so that was being written by Shlomo Alkabetz. Also, it's worth pointing out that not only these guys studying together, they're marrying each other's sisters and stuff. Joseph Cordovero married Shlomo. So Cordovero's father-in-law. So you have all kinds of. This is not just sort of an intellectual thing. They're like kind of in bed with each other. And so this is a very tight-knit world. I can only imagine some Kabbalistic drama that must have precipitated in those circles. I would love to see Kabbalistic drama, but unfortunately a lot of that doesn't survive. It's got a rough idea about what some of these texts look like. So this is Pardes Romim. This is the main text of Joseph Cordovero. This is the central text of the Cordoverian system of Kabbalah. I've got a rough idea about how dense it is. It's about that long. Right, so it's a substantial text. This doesn't have any commentary, by the way. It's just the straight text. And if you want to get a sense of what this looks like inside, it's pretty dense, wall-to-wall text, right? Get a sense of what this looks like. So these texts, Pardes Romim, incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging text to try to read. There is no translation of this into English at all. I don't think it needs. There's no systematic translation for sure. And these texts, many of these foundational texts of Kabbalah still do not have English translations, which is kind of mind-blowing considering how popular at least some version of Kabbalah is, and many of the foundational texts aren't available in English. Even finding copies in Hebrew is challenging. So this one is an example of the early systematization of the Sefer Zohar we found in Cordovero. And again, trying to find these texts are super difficult, and finding English translations that just don't exist. They just straightforwardly don't exist. So studying Kabbalah in the original languages is basically what you have to do if you're going to get really deep into Kabbalah. Fundamentally in Hebrew, we're talking about So, beginning in the 15th century, not only are Jews interested in Kabbalah, but Christians are too. This is a strange turn of events, but it's really important in the development of Western Christian spirituality, especially esoteric spirituality. As you, I'm sure, know, by the 15th century, there was a movement in Italy that called the Renaissance or whatever. But what we have is the arrival of a great deal of new texts that are being imported from Greece. I say new, they're actually really old texts. But they're being imported into Italy, and what's happening is that many of these old texts, they are underwriting an idea that's going on, that in order to get sort of a pure intellectual reality or a pure intellectual appreciation of what's going on in the world, we need to go back in time and look at the original text, look at the original foundations of this literature. This is sometimes called the Ad Fontes revival, which is the sources revival. And what you get is a massive translation project led by people like Marsilio Ficino, who are translating for the first time the entire works, for instance, of Plato. Most Christians in the Middle Ages had basically never read Plato. They had fragments of things. They had the Timaeus and they had other documents, but most pieces of Plato had never been read by a medieval Christian. It just didn't exist. And so you have an enormous influx of new, old ideas coming in from Greece in the 15th century. And there was an idea that was current at the time that primordial wisdom was somehow more reliable than what was going on in the Middle Ages. In fact, the Renaissance humanists are going to refer to that time period before them as Gothic. The Goths, of course, were the people that destroyed the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, and the humanists really hated these people. They thought they were backwards, superstitious, and their writing was incomprehensible, etc. And so there was a long idea of the Renaissance humanists that the Middle Ages basically was a mistake. All of the scholasticism, all of it was a mistake. And so what we need to do is go back to the original Latin and Greek writers and learn from the original sources, not through a bunch of commentaries and cut all that out and go back and read just the original sources. And so this Ad Fontes approach also included a great deal of what's going on in Jewish writing as well, because Christians believe that fundamentally Christianity has emerged from Judaism and primordial wisdom to be had by and that primordial Christianity had not quite covered. And so Kabbalah seems to be primordial wisdom given to Moses at some level, and then transmitted to Shimon Bar Yochai eventually transferred into the Sefer Zohar. And so the idea is that the Kabbalah was one form of this primordial wisdom, along with Zoroastrianism and Plato and Hermes Trismegistus and these sort of figures. And so there was an idea that Kabbalah had secrets that had been preserved by the Jews, but the Jews had preserved them, but they didn't understand them. Because, of course, the Jews are backwards, blind people who reject the Messiah and don't understand anything. And so the idea was the Jews had all this Kabbalah, but the Jews really didn't understand it. And so these Christians really begin to turn their attention to the Kabbalah, and they begin to recruit non-Jews, that is to start Jews, former Jews who have converted to Christianity, are Jews who are kind of amenable to this sort of humanistic project. And so we have converted Jews, converso folks like Lysias and Euphrates, and we also have just Jews who are just kind of cool with learning together, folks like Yochanan and Elneno. And what ends up happening is that many of the texts of Kabbalah slowly begin to be translated from Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin. And as those texts begin to get translated into Latin, Christians begin to see that, one, there's something really interesting and really captivating about the Kabbalah, and two, they begin to believe that the Kabbalah actually proves the truth of Christianity. And so they use it not just as a way of accessing primordial wisdom, but also part of what is sometimes referred to as the Latin polemical tradition, where Jewish texts are marshaled against Jews in the interest of converting them. And so the Kabbalah is actually mined for all kinds of Trinitarian ideas. The first three Sefirot are actually the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and all kinds of other ideas where the basic structure is that underneath the hood of Kabbalah is actually a kind of mystical Christianity. The Jews just can't see it. And so what ends up happening is a lot of these texts begin to be translated from Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin. And this begins to form a time period where some of these early Christian Kabbalists are combining ideas from Plato, ideas from the Hermetic world, the ideas from Hermes Trismegistus. They begin to combine ideas from Kabbalah. They're beginning to form synthetic new versions of Christianity, as you can imagine, are pretty controversial. So Kabbalah becomes one of the admixtures by which a new kind of Christianity is beginning to emerge, a kind of esoteric Christianity begins to emerge in the 15th century. And some of the adopters of these are some pretty famous folks, at least in the history of mysticism or the history of the occult. There's going to be folks like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who's famous academic theses, challenged the Pope to basically debate him about these, and basically Ficino thought that Pico had thought that he had fundamentally synthesized all knowledge, Kabbalah, Christianity, Pythagoreanism, everything. He thought he had systematized every form of knowledge into a coherent system of 900 theses, and that he basically said, I want to debate people about this. I'll show you that I'm right. And his Kabbalistic theses are among some of the earliest examples of Christian Kabbalah, and they are at the pinnacle of the book. They come at the very, very end. There's the final theses in the 900 theses, and he really thinks that Kabbalah has really landed on some of these things in a way that no one else has. Francesco Giorgi is also a really early systematic incorporator of Hermetic and Kabbalistic ideas into Christianity. His works are really, really difficult to access. I don't think they've been translated to English, and they are some of the earliest examples of systematic analysis of Christianity using Kabbalah as a lens. Athanasius Kircher, of course, famous German polymath, also integrated Kabbalah in his, and his version of the Tree of Life, Bates Time, has gone on to basically become the standard one in the Christian occult world, or the occult world more generally. Folks who exist in places like the Golden Dawn or in Hermetic orders, often the form of the Kabbalah they're inheriting is actually traceable back to folks like Athanasius Kircher or to Johann Rothschild. Rothschild also a very important scholar of Hebrew, perhaps one of the greatest scholars of Hebrew in the Renaissance. And his two works, De Refugio and De Kabbalistica, are systematic presentations of both Kabbalistic ideas but also Kabbalistic texts translated in their entirety into Hebrew. Many non-Jews whose first encounter with Kabbalah was almost certainly going to be a translation of the Kabbalistica, and that, or another version of this, another text is Kabbalah Devridata, the Kabbalah Unveiled, by Christian Rabbi Rothschild. You see a bunch of the Catholic Germans. The Germans were pretty interested in this. I mean, in fact, many people have made the argument that the Protestant Reformation had its origins in this kind of touch with Kabbalah. That Kabbalah is sort of the escape velocity of the Protestant Reformation to some level needs to get away from Catholicism, and that the bridge at some level away from Catholicism, the gravitational pull away from Catholicism at some level at a very early strata was Kabbalah. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Martin Luther was really interested in Kabbalah. He wasn't. Something a whole different ball of wax. At any rate, Kabbalah Devridata is incredibly helpful. Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy is probably the standard text in the Renaissance on occult philosophy and magic. Virtually all magic practitioners who operate now in the West, let's say folks for whom magic is a part of their spiritual practice, almost certainly trace all of their theory back at some level to Cornelius Agrippa. So Agrippa's these 3 books of occult philosophy are foundational, and Agrippa integrates Kabbalah into his thinking seamlessly. He really is deeply connected to ideas and Kabbalah. So what I want to point out is that Christians are also interested in Kabbalah. I think I mentioned this maybe a couple times ago, that the first time that the Zohar was printed, it was printed in a single volume at Cremona at the behest of Christians. Christians wanted it. It wasn't Jews trying to get it printed. The Jewish version was printed in Mantua just about a year later in 3 volumes, which is still standard now to print Kabbalah, to print the Zohar in 3 volumes. But the Cremona 1-volume edition was basically printed at the behest of Christians. I think I saw one at auction a couple of years ago for a couple $1,000 or something. It's a very rare volume. But at any rate, just to say that Kabbalah isn't just affecting Jews. It's also deeply affecting Christians. Christians are also really interested in the development of Kabbalah, and what's going to end up happening is that will form a trajectory by which Christians will begin to interiorize a lot of Kabbalistic ideas, and that will at some level lay the foundation for what we sometimes call Western esotericism in the practice of the occult. So Kabbalah is wrapped up in that entire project. And I bet if you've ever seen an example of like a magical circle or something, you'll see Hebrew words written all around the periphery or whatever. A lot of it has to do with the influence of Kabbalah onto Christianity and onto Christianity's more esoteric, more occult side. Christian Kabbalah has its own life, and eventually comes to become a new form of Kabbalah called Hermetic Kabbalah, which is very influential in occult circles, primarily beginning in the 19th century. Let's go back to Safed. Right? Let's go back to Safed. Safed's really the stage that we're the stage where all this is playing out. So Moshe ben Yaakov Cordovero is going to die, as all people do, and so his death in some way signals the end of one process, one cycle of Kabbalistic development. And I will say that you can, in some sense, divide Kabbalistic history into two big phases. The first phase is from the early Kabbalah and Sefer Zohar all the way to Cordovero. That's one section of Kabbalah. The rest of Kabbalah can be divided into everything after that. We are all living in the shadow of what comes next. And what comes next is Luria. Luria arrived actually at Safed from Jerusalem. He was originally born in Jerusalem, although he grew up primarily in Egypt. He arrived at Safed, according to the legend at least, on the very day that Cordovero died. And allegedly he saw as the funeral train was making its way to the graveyard, which you can still go see Cordovero's tomb in Safed. I've seen it, it's right there. You can make your way to Cordovero's tomb, and the funeral train allegedly, as Luria said, he saw a pillar of fire rising in front of the funeral train. Now, for folks who know some Bible, you'll recognize that image immediately, right? That's how God appeared to the Israelites during the Exodus. That God appeared to the Israelites as a pillar of fire. And so literally, it's like Luria says that God appeared before the funeral train of Cordovero as a pillar of fire that settled in Safed. Luria's life prior to this whole couple of years before he dies in Safed is actually relatively unremarkable. He is born in Jerusalem. His father dies when he's relatively young, and he's raised by his maternal uncle in Egypt. His uncle is actually relatively wealthy, pretty wealthy guy, and he provides Luria with a very high quality Jewish education. And in his 20s, Luria obtains what seems to be an early printed copy of the Zohar, maybe the Mantua, the volume Mantua version, and he becomes completely infatuated with it. In fact, so infatuated that he basically goes derelict of duty. He was supposed to become a business person. He abandons that. He had married, and he just basically abandons his wife. And he just kind of lives most of his days meditating out in a hut near the Nile. And it's during those years, those 15 or some odd years of him meditating on the Nile in this hut that he built for himself, that he begins, it seems, to formulate the idea that ultimately will become Luria and Kabbalah as we know it. At some point, he has a kind of mystical breakthrough. I mean, even his birth was allegedly heralded by Elijah the prophet. And there's all kinds of legends that have now grown up around Luria. That his birth, that is before he was born, that Elijah the prophet appeared to his father. At any rate, Luria would eventually make his way back to Jerusalem, and then he would eventually make his way to Safed, arriving, as I said, on the day of Cordovero's death. And he would spend a couple of years there, just a couple of years, probably 2 or 3 years, and he died before he turned 40. This is one of these guys that, the flame that burns twice as bright only burns half as long. This guy just burned out. He was just such a titanic individual, and his ideas were just shockingly original. Well, with Cordovero dead, many people, I think, did believe that Cordovero was the Messiah, and when he died, it was a real big disappointment that he but when Cordovero died, there was the idea that, no, there's something else coming. Cordovero was a herald, maybe kind of like Elijah for the coming Messiah. And it's like Luria fit into that perfectly. Luria began to teach Kabbalah basically every day. He had introductory level Kabbalah classes. Come to Luria's Kabbalah Academy and learn intro Kabbalah. He also began to develop an inner circle of people that he began to teach his own ideas to. And the inner circle was composed of several students. We know a good bit about those students. And what's weird is that he seems to have taught different versions of things to different students. And we know that because they say so, that some people were allowed some things, and some people were allowed others, and some people got some part of the system, and some people got others. And we can see this in the publications because, for instance, one of Luria's students, Israel Saru, who doesn't really get any credits or anything, and no one really pays attention to him because of the time he taught. But Israel Saru was one of the earliest publishers of Chaim Vital's works, or Isaac Luria's works rather, and he published them in Italy and popularized them. And so a big part of what's going on with Isaac Luria really wants Kabbalistic ideas popularized. That's probably part of his sort of general messianic program. He believes in a very intense way that the Messiah is a hair's breadth away, and that if Kabbalah gets out there, it will usher in the Messianic age immediately. That kind of Messianic fervor is going to prove to be a disaster here in system today. So we'll get back to that later. Messianic fervor is almost always going to be a disaster. At any rate, he began to build the inner core of people, and then he died. He died. He died like 2 years into being in Safed. And so his death wasn't, he was always kind of sickly, so completely shocking. But after his death, his two most important students would be Israel Sarugo, I mentioned a moment ago, and the other, of course, the much more important student, at least historically, is going to be Chaim Vital. And it's going to be Chaim Vital's interpretation of the ideas of the Arizal, of Isaac Luria, that are going to become definitive. The Arizal himself, Isaac Luria basically wrote nothing. He wrote a couple of Aramaic poems. That's all for Shabbat. That's all he had. He didn't really write much. He taught, and his students sort of synthesized things that he taught. And it's a synthesized documents of him. There's a long tradition of this kind of thing, right? The Buddha never wrote anything down. Jesus never wrote anything down. Muhammad couldn't read or write. There's a whole long tradition of people. Socrates famously never wrote anything. There's a whole long tradition of people who don't write things down and yet go on to change the world. So if you really want to change the world, don't write books. Writing books is a surefire way that you will not change the world. You have to be a charismatic leader and don't write anything. Just talk to people. And if you talk to people and you're charismatic enough, they will do all the writing for you. And, and again, it's like Lord was always there in Safed for 2 or 3 years. And he managed to make this kind of decisive through his student Chaim Vital. So, what do we know about the system of Luria and Kabbalah? Well, I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now, I'm not going to be able to systematically go through every part of it because it is incredibly difficult and morose in its details. But the main thing to know about it is that whereas Cordovero was moving in a much more rationalistic, much more intellectualistic, much more systematic direction when it comes to trying to unpack the ideas of the Sacred Zohar, Luria is much more interested on the mythos of the Zohar. He's much more interested in the evolving process that the Zohar seems to describe about how God goes from being infinitely recessed to becoming present in the world. And so Luria's main shift is that he's going to shift away from trying to systematically analyze every aspect of how reality was constructed, but rather focus on the unfolding, the dynamic unfolding of reality and the mythology of that unfolding. And it's the mythology, and I say mythology, I don't mean falseness or like the Loch Ness Monster as a myth, but it's the doing of it that really matters to him. Because for Luria, the entire drama of the unfolding or the evolution of reality as we know it isn't in the past, it's always present to us. And so in a way that the Cordovero might describe that the events of the unfolding of the universe via the Sephirot are events in the past, the primordial past. For Luria, time is really weird because for him it's all happening at once. It's happened back then, it's happening now, and at some level it's kind of happening in the future, and the future is kind of reaching for us to redeem us. And so even notions like time become very weird in the Lurianic system. So what we get is that he's primarily interested in what I call the mythological structure, the genesis of reality, and as that development is comprehensible at any given moment in the development of humanity or of God. For Luria, the development of God and the development of humanity are tied together. They're the same development, basically. His system, as far as we have it, is a really highly developed system of analyzing reality. I can't say that it's always terribly coherent, and I certainly can't say that I always understand. But what he's focused on, what his core is what often gets called the order of development or the order of evolution. This is often referred to as the Seder Hishtachlut. the order of evolution. In fact, the Shatalut is actually a standard modern word for evolution, like winning evolution. So it's the evolution of reality. Now, just again, these evolutionary models are constructive, right? Because at some level, biological past is inside them. That is to say that you contain all kinds of things in your DNA from what we used to be. We're not apes like the apes before us. We contain DNA fragments of those apes. The past is still with us, or as Bill Faulkner said, that the past is existing. And that's true also for Floridian and Kabbalah. The idea is, yes, there were things that happened in the primordial past, the primordial past, those things are current to us now, they're still happening. And so what we get is that there is a sort of spiraling cycle of aggression. That is to say, the world is coming into being, the world is emerging as such, always emerging as such. And further, right, it's also regressing. It's also going back to the way that it was. So there is an incredible dynamism in the Lurianic system where you kind of don't know quite where you are in time, in space. You don't quite know where you are even in righteousness. So there's a kind of constant movement to and fro, where the world is on the one hand becoming exiled, and on the other hand, it's becoming redeemed. And so the Lurianic system, part of what makes it so difficult is that at the heart of the system is this dialectical structure where everything is happening all at once and everything is also being erased all at once. And so it's very difficult to figure out at what moment something is happening, because at every moment, everything's always happening. And so knowing exactly what's going on in the system is very complicated, because the system is so dynamic. It's almost like a fractal, that the more you zoom in on a region of the fractal, the more the entire fractal reproduces for you. And so the system is very, very fractalized like that. And so it's often difficult to know exactly what's going on. But let's go over some of the core ideas of Zaccharia. The big first idea is his concept of Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum was an idea that was developed by Cordovero, actually. In fact, Cordovero was a teacher of Zaccharia for a brief time, 1570 maybe. And so Cordovero had to solve a problem. The problem is, well, how do you get from an infinite God whose light reaches every metaphysical, ontological aspect of reality, God's being, so it must occupy every point within that infinity? How do you get to the idea that there's a gap? How do you get to the idea there's a place where God isn't in order for the world to be? Because it can't be the case that God is completely in fullness when the system's full, and you can't have a world. You can't have the Olamot. You can't have the worlds. So God has to create an emptiness, a divine emptiness, a vacuum. And what God does is God contracts some region of God's self. I use words like region, but again, these spatial concepts are not accurate. But God ontologically contracts God's self. And that ontological contraction creates a void. And that void is both surrounded by God and yet is not God. It's a kind of gap or a vacuum. Always imagine like when you have to you gain a couple pounds and you need to get in some old pants, so you suck your belly in and tighten your belt real tight. It's like God sucking in God's belly to get his belt on or something. I don't know how to. I always imagine that image for some reason. So God creates this void, this Tzimtzum, and into that Tzimtzum, into that void, into that contraction, that will be where the Olamot appear. The Olamot are the four worlds that comprise our reality. We do not have access to God's infiniteness. We just don't. It's just, we're finite. We do not have access to God's infiniteness. And so what we do have access to is what's left over from the process of filling that void. Now, how does that void get filled? Well, God, it's almost like a laser. God concentrates some of God's light. God finitizes some of God's light. And that finitized light, that finitized existence of God is permitted to enter into the void. And when it enters into the void, it cascades into the void. And that cascading, as it moves from the primal source of the divine into the void, it begins to weaken, so to speak. And as it begins to weaken, as it titters down into the void, as it flows down into the void, it begins to weaken. And as it weakens, there are strategic parts, or the decisive parts in the weakening of the light into the void. Just like if you were shining a laser, it's only going to be so powerful, it's only going to reach so far. The further it gets, the lighter it gets, and the more it begins to break down and begins to fade away. God shoots that light into the void. This is also found in the Sefer Zohar. And as that light goes in, it begins to break down. And as it breaks down into four distinct realms. And those four distinct realms are the fundamental structures of reality. The first one is Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon is the primeval body of God. It's the way that we imagine God to be. It's this, when you think of God as a person, what you're imagining is Adam Kadmon. It's the first primeval glimpse of God as a being. Because before that, God is just infinite light, and God is utterly unimaginable. The first glimpse is Adam Kadmon, sort of like a negative image of God on board. The next layer down is the realm of absolute organization. Then down further is the world of Beriah, right, where God is becoming more and more concretized, not yet physical, but more and more concretized. And then we get to the world of formation, where God is recognized. And then finally we get down to the world of Asiyah, and we are actually in a subsection of the world of Asiyah, and that sometimes is called the five world, the four world, because our physical reality is distinct from all other four worlds in the world of Asiyah. So the four worlds, the Olamot, are the ontological registers of reality. And what Luria imagines, and the reason why he imagines these four worlds is that every single time there is a movement within the Godhead, an evolution in the Godhead, a change in the Godhead, that change has to be understood as a logical, dialectical progression of how God is mutating, how God is changing. Because every time God interacts with something, that image of God, that aspect of God alters. And so what we get in the world of the various registers of reality is we get entirely different branches of the Sphirot. Now, I might pull this up when we get to the Q&A later, is that one thing that makes the organic system so mind-bogglingly complicated is that every register of reality has its own separating structure. And inside of every Sphirot is more Sphirot. And so there are Sphirot inside of Sphirot inside of Sphirot. There are Sphirot on the backside of Ra, which is the Sitra Achra, the world of evil. It is again, for folks who are familiar with mathematics, it's like that anytime you zoom in on any register of reality, you begin to see that the entire system of reality is reproduced over and over and over and over again. And you have these enormously complex, what are called Ilanot, or tree systems. And those really complex Ilanot or tree systems describe the various Sphirot as they're interacting with each other at these various registers of reality. We can't go into the various levels of reality in time, but each one of them is distinct, and each one of them is a moment in the development of the Godhead. Now, some folks who have some background in philosophy, folks who had some background perhaps in Hegel, this is going to sound really familiar because if you remember the logic of the progression of the logic in Hegel, Hegel actually commends Kabbalah as prefiguring his logic. Now, I'm not sure if that's an indictment of Kabbalah or not, depending on what you think of Hegel, but Hegel's system of the unfolding of reality is deeply influenced by the Lurianic sort of folding out structure of reality. Now, as God's light begins to travel through the void, what ends up happening is that the very structures that emerge to hold God's light, the very moment of the divine, as the light gets further and further and further into the void, the very structures that are meant to hold the divine light can't. They're just too far away. It's just like, I don't know, it's a moment where you feel yourself, you're holding on to something right, and you feel yourself slipping off. There's a moment where you just let go. And that let go moment, the moment where the spheres, the actual vessels that hold God's light, because they've gotten so far away from the original source, they don't have enough energy, they don't have enough dynamism, they don't have enough of tisuk, they don't have enough strength to hold God's light, and they shatter. And that shattering, the shtirah, the shattering of the vessels, is as it falls in, they overpower the vessels, right, and they shatter. It's like putting, folks ever seen this, right? You take a really cold glass vessel and pour really hot water into it, right? Or, I'm sure you've seen folks, right, throw hot water on a cold windshield because people don't know any better. But imagine, right, hot water being poured into an ice cold vessel. The ice cold vessel is the vacuum, the void, the simsum, and when you pour the lightning hot rays of God into it, the vessels just shatter. And that shattering forms what are called klipot, shards. And these shards of the vessels, these shards are characterized by disharmony and disunity. They're broken aspects of the divine. They're aspects of the divine that are localized, just like if you'd imagine taking a part of your own personality and breaking it off of you. So just imagine your curiosity, right? You took pure curiosity, which is a pretty good trait, and broke it off and made it its own thing. Pure curiosity is a disaster because anything that's purely curious is going to get yourself killed, it's going to hurt people, it's not going to have any ethics, it'll just experiment on people. And even love, right? Pure love, if you take it away and put it with no checks at all, it's too much. Any aspect of the divine, broken away from the divine, and then given its own reality, will always be too much. No matter what it is, whether it's God's wrath or God's goodness, whether it's God's curiosity, whatever, none of these things can exist on their own. And the shards of these vessels, according to Gloria, become evil. But because they're localized, intense versions of the divine, they shouldn't be allowed to exist on their own. And because they shouldn't be allowed to exist on their own, they go haywire. And these become evil in the Lurianic system. This is the origin of evil. The demons of the world are the shards of the vessels that once held God's light. Because they're just out of control. They're completely disunited, completely unharmonious. And so they're sort of like extreme versions of God. And so these demonic aspects of the Lurianic system are these potent. And they are the object of a process called tikkun. And I bet you're already beginning to hear, right, where we're going to get to next, right, the idea of tikkun olam. Well, we are, right, at the very end of that system. The entire giant system of God, Tzimtzum, and God pouring God's light in, the entire process of shattering of the vessels, we are at the limit of that system. And so at the very limit of that system, right, it's like a rubber band, right, as you stretch a rubber band out, let it go, it flies all the way this way, and it flies back. We are at the very end, the receiving end of all of the divine system. We are at the very bottom of the system, and we are the part of the system that begins to move back up. Right? We are the system, we are the part that moves things back up. And what happens is that we recognize, Lurianic Kabbalists recognize, that the shards of the divine, the klipot, can be rectified by engaging in the magic of the Torah. Again, it's like Luria is not sort of a hippie mystic. He says, no, you repair the world, metaphysically repair the world by engaging in the metaphysical act of engaging in following God's law. Because the divine law, the Torah is the system, it's like the source code of all realities. And if you follow it, and if you do it correctly, it fixes reality. Reality is broken at some level. And so the fix is, according to Luria, the very strict following of the Jewish law, of the Halakha, and of the Torah. So by following the Torah, you repair reality. And this is where the phrase tikkun olam comes from. You are repairing the world. Now, I know that most folks hear the word tikkun olam and think something like helping people who are charity or something like that. But for Luria, it's not just a fixing the world in terms of the social ills or doing social justice stuff. That's, of course, part of it too. But by having the right kavanah, by having the right concentration, by having the right intention, by doing the Jewish law with absolute intention, purity of heart, by performing things like Shabbat, by putting tefillin on, by observing the fast of Yom Kippur, or whatever, all these things help to repair reality. They fix reality at the metaphysical level. They give reality a tikkun. And further, you begin to build the world of the Messiah. Because for the Lurianic system, the act of reparation, the act of repairing the world, begins to sort of build the world in which the Messiah can emerge. And at some level, you can imagine that Messiah is kind of the keystone of the entire process. The Messiah is the person who will turn the key. We will build the world worthy of Messiah. The Messiah will come and turn the key, and they will unfurl the final redemption. And so it's by repairing the world that we prepare the world for the possibility of the Messiah. And this idea is going to have enormous impact in the history of Judaism. If you've ever hung out with folks in the Chabad Lubavitch movement, and around Chabad people who light candles, felon, you can be walking around New York and I'll have some guy like I'll stop in the street like, hey, you put your phone on today? And I'm like, no. He's like, can you put your phone on now? Why would they bother you on the street to put your phone on? It's not because they're trying to do you a favor. They're trying to engage into Islam. They think that every Jew, whatever that means to them, who can engage in the process of Islam and put the phone on will usher in the days of the Messiah that much more quickly. And so they're trying at some level to accelerate, right? One can think about Kabbalistic ideas or Luria and Kabbalah, kind of Jewish accelerationism. The world is broken and they're trying to accelerate the process by which it's repaired. And you accelerate that process by engaging in spiritual warfare against the klipot and by binding and then repairing the klipot in a way that allows you to basically accelerate the process by which the Messiah comes. And if you read Chaim Vital, he really does think that he definitely thinks he's a Messiah. He just thinks that he has to be a little bit more righteous. If you could just be a little bit more righteous, if you just think about that woman, right, when he was praying, if you just didn't think that dirty thought, if you just memorized a little bit more Mishnah, that would have been revealed as the Messiah. He would have emerged as the Messiah. This is an idea you see him constantly in his journals. Chaim Vital simultaneously manages to be both incredibly self-deprecating and also incredibly arrogant. I guess that tends to go hand in hand. But sometimes he's, I'm not worthy, I'm unworthy of anything, I'm the lowest of the low, and it's like, yeah, if I'd just done this, I'd have been the Messiah. So the idea is that the Messiah is right around the corner, and it's the result of this process of time. Now, of course, that idea's got retrofitted in sort of liberal Jewish circles for social justice, but in the classical Kabbalistic world, it has everything to do with strict obedience to Quran. Another key innovation in the Lurianic system is that Luria is really obsessed with some of the more bizarre sections of the Zohar. There are 3 sections of the Zohar that are notoriously difficult to understand. Two of them are the Idrot, the assemblies, and the final is a section called Sifra Tzniuta. And Sifra Tzniuta is a relatively brief section of the Zohar that contains a long description of God's beard. And then there's another section that also contains a description of God's beard, but also God's face in general. And no one's really sure what in the world's going on in those sections. They're really, really weird. Weird even compared to the other sections of Zohar. Zohar is weird enough, but it's like weird on weird. And it's like Luria develops a systematization of this idea of the movements within the divine face. That the divine is actually reflective of metaphysical changes in reality. And that the divine face are the countenances, the parts of theme, that these parts of theme are arrangements of the Sefirot, and those arrangements of the Sefirot are indicators of certain kinds of changes and developments within the divine. I will go ahead and say this, the parts of theme is without a doubt the most complicated part of the entire structure of Luria and Kabbalah, because it's analyzing the Sefirot in terms of how they're arranged and how the various system relates to itself internally. And it is just completely difficult to understand. I still struggle trying to figure out, I know what the various configurations are, I know what Ima and Chaim or whatever, I know what the structures look like, but when you begin to analyze how they move and change in relationship to other mystical stuff going on in the Arizal system, it just becomes a maze. So I have a real difficult time keeping track of what's going on in this sort of inner development of Godhead. But what's important to note is that for Luria, God is not a thing, God is a process. And God is changing all the time. So when God tells to Moshe Rabbeinu, right, I'll be what I'll be, Luria takes that really seriously. God is changing. God is a process. God is not a thing, God is a process. And that process is reality. And we are part of that process. And just like you get angry, so does God. And just like you get, compassionate, so does God. And that the change of God from angry to compassion, or the change from a normal state of affairs to being angry, that change in your emotions can be mapped. And so ditto with God, a change in God's emotional life can be mapped. And those mappings of God's emotional psychology or intellectual psychology are the parts of it. It's a very complicated part of the inner psychology, inner divine psychology. It's a really complicated stuff. Also, famously, it's like Luria is going to reintroduce is the concept of reincarnation in Judaism. Reincarnation is an idea that never really took hold in most of the Abrahamic faiths, although there are tiny groups of people who still believed in it at some point. But most of the larger Abrahamic faiths have rejected reincarnation for various reasons. However, in the Lurianic Kabbalah, reincarnation is completely acceptable. In fact, it's part of the system. In fact, if you just want to, sort of a general idea, this is Chaim Vital's major work. It's time. This is the most systematic account of Isaac Luria's philosophy. So this is the major work of Isaac Luria's philosophy as articulated by Chaim Vital, and this is the standard now 2-volume text on reincarnation by Chaim Vital's teachings of Yitzhak Luria on reincarnation. This is the Shai of the means of reincarnation. So reincarnation is an idea that is reintroduced into Judaism. It may have existed earlier in some ways, but certainly Chaim Vital really introduces it via Yitzhak Luria. The idea is that every single person has what they call a soul root. And the soul root is a kind of aspect of your soul. There are 5 different layers of your soul according to the Lurianic system. And some of those parts of your soul go all the way back to the beginning of all creation. And various people have had that soul. You are like a root. You are a root, and there are things growing off the root. And you're one of the things growing off the root. And there are many people prior to you that have had the same soul as you. Now, the bad thing about that is they've committed all kinds of sins that you're now responsible for fixing. Because again, remember, the Luria's system is dynamic. Just because you engage in tikkun once doesn't mean that you didn't do bad stuff before. If you did bad stuff, well, if you break the Jewish law, that further damages reality. And so there have been people in the past that have really damaged reality. Maybe in your past life there was something really bad. Chaim Vital, by the way, his soul root was Cain, the first murderer. And so as you can imagine, Chaim Vital, whose soul root was Cain, had a lot to fix. This was the literal origin of murder in the world. And so he had to undergo all kinds of what are called tikkunim, reparations, and these reparations include everything from ascetic practices to read certain parts of the Bible to engage in mystical practices. And so the idea is that not only are you responsible for you being good you have to make up for all the things that have happened prior to you. So every person that's had your soul prior to you are now responsible for figuring out how to fix all the bad things that you did, because all the bad things are still there. You're most apt to fix them. Now, how do you figure that out? You go to a mystic, a Kabbalist, and the Kabbalist will tell you who your soul root is, and they will tell you all the bad things that you've done, and they will give you tikkunim and how to fix them. Tikkunim can be anything from extra prayers to amulets to fasting, there are all kinds of tikkunim that we can have. If you ever go to Sfat, if you ever go to Safed to this day, you can go to Kabbalists. I've seen signs where they will go and they will figure out who your soul root is. And they're alleged experts who know how to do this. How they know how to do this, give it to them, that's fine. And they can figure out who your soul root is, and they will tell you that your soul root was Lamech, and you have to make them descend, and you are inheriting descends, and these are the kind of tikkunim that you need to do, reparation you need to do to fix the sins of your past lives. Reincarnation has entered into Judaism completely intact, and it is a completely viable way of thinking about your afterlife. It's not heterodox at all. It's very normative at this point, and so reincarnation, with the rise of Lurianic Kabbalah, is completely normalized in a way that I don't think it is in Christianity and Islam. I think in Christianity and Islam, if you want to believe in reincarnation, you don't want to make a big deal of it. I think if you make a big deal of it, if you're a Catholic, whatever, you're in trouble. Whereas in Judaism, reincarnation is completely normalized. Now, but it's only normalized within the system of Lurianic Kabbalah, where you would, if you want to find out who your reincarnation is of, you need to do the work of fixing all the sins that you may be shocked to learn all the bad things you did in your past life. Now, you do also learn the merit of the past life, but you also learn all the bad stuff too. This idea that the soul can survive death, that it can be reborn, also it means that various other regions of the soul, again, you have 5 regions of your soul. Some other regions of your soul can actually survive death and become detached from the other regions. And those detached parts of your soul, if you committed a lot of sins in your life, they become addicted to those sins. And those that aspect of your soul that becomes addicted to those sins actually can roam around and want to continue committing sins in the next life. This is especially true of sexual sin, but also gluttony and drunkenness and stuff. And so if you were a lecherous, drunken, bad person, then if you become addicted to those things, when you die, your soul polluted, that it will become detached from your other souls and and what it wants to do, it wants to continue doing what it did, getting drunk and having sex and whatever. And so what it will do is it will try to attach itself to other people, because you can't really get drunk and have sex if you're just a soul, so you got to get attached to someone else. And so when your soul attaches, your evil soul attaches itself to the people, the word for to attach in Hebrew is dabak, right? In fact, the modern Hebrew word for glue comes from the same root word. Your soul dabak, it clings to other people, and that soul that clings to other people possesses them. This is the origin of the dibuk. The dibuk is the evil version of your soul, it's the evil aspect of your soul that roams around and tries to attach itself to the people. And the very earliest exorcism stories that we have in Judaism are actually from Satan. In fact, we taught a whole class on spirit possession in Judaism. And if you want to learn more about this, I have some episodes on my YouTube channel as well. But what you have here is demonic possession. Demonic possession is not the right word. It's not a demon. It's actually an evil, dead person doing the possessing. And so dibuk can become a big deal in the Kabbalistic world as well. But the opposite is true too. The soul of very righteous people hangs around near their grave. And if you need to get some spiritual chizuk, some righteousness, let's say that you're traveling somewhere and you know that your old paramour is going to be there and you don't want to hook up with them. This is a real example, by the way. You don't want to hook up with them if you're married or whatever. You want to commit adultery. That's bad. So what do? You go into the graveyard of a righteous person and you lay on the grave of the righteous person, and you meditate on their soul and you invite their soul into your soul, and they impregnate you. This is called ibor. And the soul of the righteous person will impregnate your soul with a little bit of their righteousness, and it will give you enough of enough of righteousness that when you go to face the spiritual challenge of committing adultery, you won't do it, because it's like a shot in the arm, a shot in the soul from the righteous person, and the righteous person will give you the spiritual power to overcome your failure, your sin. And then they will come back to their grave and they'll come up. For folks who know a little bit about Buddhism, right, this sounds a bit like bodhisattvas, right? The idea that there are people who are enlightened in the Buddhist tradition, but they become so enlightened, they don't become completely enlightened, so they can stay just around here to help the rest of us schmucks, right? These are bodhisattvas. They don't leave, they don't go to nirvana, they stay here to help the rest of us get a little bit more enlightened. And so these tzaddakim, these righteous people, you can go lay on their graves, and you can get a little bit of spiritual power from their soul, and it'll go into your soul and help you. This to this day. People do this. It's a problem, actually. People get caught in graveyards and lying on graves to get soul power. Soul power is a cool 70s. So at any rate, so this idea of dibur becomes a big idea as well. So dibuk, right, is evil souls becoming attached to your body. They can also get in animals, by the way. They don't like to be an animal. Apparently it's not good in there, but they want to get into people. And Chaim Vital, by the way, also became one of the earliest exorcists in this whole tradition. And by the way, he failed. He also get the dibuk to leave, and then as soon as the dibuk left, it will come back and repossess the person and kill them. And so there's all kinds of great dibuk stories. If you've never seen the movie The Dibuk, it's one of the great classics of Yiddish film. Filmed in the 30s. In fact, many of the people that were in the film died in the Holocaust. And so it's really, I think they remastered it and they've redone the subtitles. And if you've ever seen The Dibuk, it's a great film from the 30s. It's a classic example of Yiddish theater and eventually Yiddish filmmaking. Probably the crowning achievement before it all went to hell with the Holocaust. But The Dibuk is a classic movie. So we're getting close to Halloween time. We're going to some Jewish Halloween movie watching. Watch The Dibuk. So the dibuk is an idea that emerges also from Lorrainic Kabbalah, but also people. As I said a minute ago, Lorrainic Kabbalah becomes just Kabbalah. If you've ever studied Kabbalah, you've heard this term, Tikkun Olam, right? You've heard of the world of Atzilut, the world of Asiya. You know that the soul has, the Yechida, and Neshama, and Ruach, and all the various parts of the soul. Lurianic Kabbalah just became Kabbalah. It absorbed all other previous forms of Kabbalah, whether it's Abraham Abulafia's Kabbalah, whether it's Cordero's Kabbalah, whether it's other forms of Kabbalah, it absorbed them all, and in some ways transcended them all. It abolished them all, and it ascended above them all. And by both eliminating all of them and then conglomerating all of them into one thing, it became a new thing. And that new thing basically has become Jewish theology. If you've ever read books of Jewish theology, modern books of Jewish theology, they are almost always derivative of Yitzhak Lurin's Kabbalah. And that's true of Hasidic people. That's true of Messianic people, the opponents of the Hasidic people. That's true of hardcore Jewish rationalists, people like the Vilna Gaon, right? The hardcore rational guy. Also hardcore Kabbalists. Kabbalah, Lurianic Kabbalah, is at some level just Jewish theology. Now, what's ironic about that, we'll talk about this more as we wrap the class up in a few weeks, why aren't these texts available then? If at some level, Tikkun Olam and all these ideas are just basically now part of our theological landscape of Judaism, why isn't it you just can't go buy a copy of Eitz's Chaim in English? Why is it you can't just go buy a copy of Cordero's Parties for Rabbi in English? Why is it that the entire 15-volume Kitvei Ha'ari, collected works of the Ari, are not translated in English? There's a reason for that. And we'll get to that in a few weeks. There is a really important reason for why that is. It has everything to do with liberal Judaism. How liberal Judaism decanonized Kabbalah. It rejected Kabbalah. And that's part of what made liberal modern Judaism is the amputation of Kabbalah from Judaism. Now that's changing, but it's not changing in the right way. Because the way it's changing is not, it's changing in the sense that Kabbalah's ideas are being imported. They're being imported haphazardly. And the original texts are not being consulted, they're not being really translated. And so modern Jews who are interested in Kabbalah don't have access to it. And that's a disaster. It's a real disaster. I mean, imagine if the works of Thomas Aquinas just weren't translated in English. You would have to rely on old Latin editions and stuff like that. It would be a mess. Well, that's what basically we have. It's as if Thomas Aquinas had the influence he did in the Catholic world, but no Catholics have access to his actual works in a reliable translation. It's a mess. It's a real mess. So, and again, this is a standard volume of Eitz's Chaim in Hebrew. You will not. There's no English translation. There's no translation. We'll talk about why in a few weeks, but there's just not one. It's a mess. It's a bad situation. So, at the end of the day, Yitzhak Luria's version of Kabbalah wins. It wins. Now, I'm not saying it's completely systematic, and I'm not saying it's completely all worked out. There's still a bunch of kinks in the system. But at the end of the day, the 15-volume collected works of the Arizal, really the works of Chaim Vital, systematizing the works at some level of the Arizal, that becomes Jewish theology. Now, on the one hand, that's really cool because Kabbalah won. On the other hand, it's a disaster because most Jews who are interested in Kabbalah, at least in the non-Orthodox world, have no access to it. It's a mess. This is a real problem. I don't know how it's going to get solved, but I mean, it's just now in the past 10 years that the entire Zohar has been translated reliably in English. So this is a big problem. We'll talk about this problem. We'll talk about why we're in this boat, how we're going to get out of it in a few weeks. But it may just, in our lifetime, it may take our entire lifetime to get out of this boat. We'll talk about where it came from, why it is that we can, how we got out of it. 6 years after Chaim Vital dies, the greatest articulator of the Lurianic system of Kabbalah, 6 years after he dies, a guy is born in Asia Minor, what is now Turkey, Izmir. He's born on Tish B'Av. He's born on Tish B'Av, which happens to fall on Shabbat that year. And the idea in Jewish lore that the Messiah will be born on the Sabbath day of the year. That the day of the year that we're born, every bad thing that's ever happened to us, the great hope is that on that day, the Messiah will be born. That in the future, Tish B'Av will no longer be a sad day. It will be a glorious day because that'll be the birthday of the Messiah. On Saturday of Tish B'Av, 6 years after the death of Chaim Vital, Shabbatai Tzvi is born. And Shabbatai Tzvi is going to transform Kabbalah because he's going to become the Messiah. And not just become the Messiah. When I say that, I mean the majority of the world's Jews were convinced he was the Messiah. He convinced the world's Jews that he was the Messiah via his publicist of Gaza using Kabbalah. And he will become enormously influential. In fact, in many ways, if you think about Judaism as a religion, in some ways, as before Shabbatai Tzvi, after. And Shabbatai Tzvi is going to transform Judaism. He's going to transform so much of what's going to happen in Judaism. And so what we're going to do is he's going to basically shake Judaism to its core. Because as you probably know, he will declare himself the Messiah. The vast majority of Jews will believe that he's the Messiah. Many of them literally have their bags packed on the docks in Amsterdam, ready to go back home to Israel to live the Messianic age. In 1666, he converts to Islam. And it is a titanic disaster. A disaster, prior to the Holocaust, there's been no greater disaster than Shabbatai Tzvi episode. No greater disaster. And from a theological point of view, it's intense. So in many ways, right, you can think about Shabbatai Tzvi as the fulcrum. And I imagine most folks here have heard the idea that you can't study Kabbalah until you're 40. I'm sure folks have heard that idea. Well, notice that it's like Gloria died before he was 40. Clearly, he was studying Kabbalah before he was 40. Where do ideas like that come from? They come in the afterlife of Shabbatai Tzvi. Because the idea that Kabbalah is so dangerous that it can lead the entire Jewish world into a disaster. And that disaster, Kabbalistic disaster, will be heralded by Shabbatai Tzvi, the false Messiah. We will turn to him and his arguments for his messiahhood next time. So Shabbatai Tzvi and also Frankism. Frankism is a derivative of Shabbatai Tzvi. So we'll turn our attention to Shabbatai Tzvi and what is sometimes referred to as mystical heresy. It's kind of like on off the rails. Totally off the rails. So we will deal with Shabbatai Tzvi and his so-called messianism. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work and providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on
11 is my audio file. Go fuck yourself.